Good morning, children. Now we are going to discuss about a new concept, friction. This friction is extents of the laws of motion. In laws of motion, we are discussing only the forces which are net forces. In that, suppose a block is placed on a surface. When we apply the force F is equals to ma. Where the surfaces we consider as the smooth surfaces. Suppose if the surface is rough surface, another force is acting. That force we call it as frictional force. And frictional force may be defined as the opposing force which comes into play tangentially between two surfaces so as to destroy the relative motion between them. Means like here, when two bodies means one is the surface of ground, then this surface is rough surface, An object is moved on the rough surface with a force is F. Means here relative motion between two surfaces. What are the two surfaces? One is black, another one is ground, rough surface. These two are the surfaces. One is the surface of black and another one is the ground. Means here two relative motion between two surfaces. Here the frictional force is tangent. This is the tangent. And this one is the normal force. This is known as force of friction. Force of friction is tangentially between of two bodies of relative. Now suppose here rolling force. Roll the object means also here rolling. Here like this. Again every point. This is the tangent. Because of this is radius. Radius is nothing but normal also. This is the normal and this one is tangent. Then the body will roll like this, tangent. So here, listen once again, the definition of friction is, friction may be defined as the opposing force which comes into play tangentially between the two surfaces, so as to destroy the relative motion between them. Is known as friction. Friction means it acts tangentially and between the two surfaces as to destroy the relative motion between them. Here, friction is a self-adjusting force and is a non-conservative force. One more point is here. Friction is self-adjusting. Friction is self-adjusting. Friction is a self-adjusting force. It is non-conservative. Is non-conservative force. Non-conservative means, what is conservative? Conservative force means work done by a closed path should be equals to 0. Work done by a force of any closed path should be equals to 0 means conservative. Here, work done by any closed path is not equals to 0 from this situation, then friction is a non-conservative force. Now, types of friction. The types of friction are three types. One is static friction, kinetic friction, rolling friction. First one is static. static friction, and second one is kinetic friction or sliding friction. Kinetic or sliding friction. Kinetic or sliding friction. And third one is rolling friction. Rolling friction. Types of frictions are three types. One is static friction, kinetic friction or sliding friction, and rolling friction. See here, this object is at rest. Object at rest. When we apply the force also, that is static friction. When we apply some force, the object is slides, means the object is displacing from this position to somewhere. That friction we call it as kinetic friction. And this one is there, the objects will roll. The objects will roll. The objects will roll means rolling friction. Rolling friction. Suppose here object at rest, when we apply force, this is applied force. Yes, applied force. Object at rest. Object at rest. This force we call it as static force. Yeah, static. When we apply some force, F applied, force applied, object is in motion. Object is in motion. Object is in motion. Then this force of friction we call it as kinetic friction. Kinetic friction. Now listen here carefully. Static friction means when we apply some force, object at rest means we apply force also. Object is not moving, object at rest. That type of force we call it as static friction. When we apply some force, the object is slides, means like object is move like this, not roll. Object will slides. Object will slide. Then this situation object is in motion, means the force of friction developed between the object and the surface we call it as kinetic friction. Kinetic friction. And rolling friction means the object will rolls. The object will rolls means it will rotates like this on the surface between two bodies. One is the surface of the rolling object, another one is surface of the ground. Means like this is the rough surface. Rough surface. Here the frictional force opposing between these two bodies is rolling friction. We observe that the types of frictions are static friction, kinetic friction, rolling friction. These are the kinetic, static, rolling frictions. Static friction means what is known as static friction means? When we applied some force, the object is at rest. Object is at rest. This friction we call it as static friction. Static friction. Object at rest, object is not. When we apply some force, object is in motion means kinetic friction. Kinetic friction. When we apply some force of this, the object will rolls. Object rolls. Here, rolls. This type of friction we call it as rolling friction. Rolling friction. Rolling friction. So here, kinetic friction, static and rolling friction. Now, here we can see that an example problem based on example problem. An object of mass m, an object of mass m. When we apply some force, force applied. So force applied on this object is placed on a rough surface. Object is at rest. Object does not move. Object is at rest. Means like here, object at rest means the force of friction is static. Force of friction is static. When we apply another force, means like suppose when we apply some force, the object is ready to motion. When we apply the force, object is ready to motion. F applied force, object at rest, the force of friction is nothing but static. Then F static is equals to F applied. F static is equals to F applied. Suppose this object is ready to move, applied force is 10 newtons is required to move the object. 10 newtons force is required to move the object. Suppose here we apply the force is 6 newtons. 6 newtons means object is not ready to move. Object is at rest. Then the force of friction is equals to F applied, that is equals to 6 newtons. Suppose force is increased, 8 newtons we increase, then the static friction, Fs means what is Fs? Static friction, force of friction is static, is equals to F applied, that is equals to 8 newtons. How much force is required to move this body? 10 newtons is required. That 10 newtons force is static frictional force, means limiting static frictional force. The object is ready to move. The object is ready to move. When we apply 10 newtons force. The object is ready to move when we apply 10 newton force. This force of friction, we call it as limiting static frictional force. Limiting static frictional force. This is the limiting static frictional force. Here say 0 less than or equals to F static force is less than or equals to F limiting. An object is placed on the surface, we should not give any force, we should not apply any force. Then also object is at rest, then force of friction is 0. We should not apply any force, the force of friction is equals to 0. When we apply the force of friction is equals to applied force until how much force is required to move the object. Means like before limiting frictional force, we applied how much force? That much force is equals to the static frictional force. This is about static frictional force. The range of static frictional force is 0 less than or equals to F static, less than or equals to F limiting.